Everybody, please welcome Joe Hill.
Thanks for having me on. How are you? I'm doing well.
There's lots to talk about with you. I'm always fascinated by the beginning of the artistic process because I think a lot of people at home, be it music or film or writing, they always feel like maybe they've got it in them, but they need something that'll help kickstart it. And I had read that when you had done Heart-Shaped Box, you had a different book in mind, and then you heard that Nirvana song, and another book came. So how did Horns start?
I was thinking about hangovers. I was thinking about what's the worst thing that could happen after a hangover.
Thinking about it or experiencing it?
I've had a few bad hangovers. I've had a few. Probably the worst was the day I agreed to do this show.
I'm pretty sure you were still drunk when you agreed to that.
Probably. So I was thinking, what would be a bad? They had this movie, The Hangover, you know, and I was thinking, what would be even worse than the stuff in that movie? If you woke up with a pair of horns growing out of your head, that would be bad. That would take some. You had too much fun the night before.
Wow, that would be arguably the worst, because who could help you with that?
Well, you know, I don't know. You know, in the story, this guy, Ig Parrish, he spends the night carousing. He wakes up with the horns. He goes hunting around for someone to help him. He goes to a doctor. He goes to a priest. He goes to his parents. But no one really wants to help him. They just want to make these hideous confessions, talk about their dirtiest urges. And it isn't long before he realizes he's sort of inherited the powers of a devil.
Which is a hell of a place.
Yeah.
Did the book end up the way you started it? Did you have an idea?
Well, when I started, I really thought that I was going to write about, you know, the devil's influence on man. And then by the time I got done with the first draft, I came to think the devil's sort of a cop-out. You know, I mean, we blame him for everything that's bad in the world, you know, war, disease, cell phones. He's on the hook for all of it, you know. But
the devil is Samsung.
Oh, you just lost a sponsor.
Yeah, okay.
No, you know, but by the time I got done with the book, you know, I came to think that, you know, that we're really bad enough without him, you know, that we create plenty of pain all on our own without the devil's help. You know, my favorite scene in the book is a scene where the devil faces down this terrible sociopath, you know, and he's scared of the sociopath. The devil is scared of the human being. And, you know, so anyway.
That's because the human being's got the soul. And if you believe in a devil, you have to believe in God has favorites, right? And that scares everybody.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I think it's also, you know, it's also not knowing. You look at someone who's good and not knowing, you know, the truth about them. That's a big idea in the story, a running theme in the story, that just because someone seems pious or decent doesn't necessarily mean they actually are. You know, Mark Twain or Sam Johnson or, you know, Conan O'Brien or someone said, you know, that...
I'm going to guess it was Conan,
yeah,
but go ahead.
The devil can always twist scripture to serve his own purposes, you know, and that's something I kind of poke at throughout the book.
Where did that first happen to you? Like, where did you first become interested in that sort of thing? I mean, much can be made about the fact every comedian has done a joke saying if you're Stephen King or Tabitha's son, your dreams become the content for their books, right?
Yeah, right. You know, the whole thing about, you know, Steve King wants to, you know, says, hey kids, do you want to hear a bedtime story? And they'll go, no! You know. And,
was that your life?
Yeah. No, you know, one of the things, it's you know, growing up, I had a very normal childhood in a lot of ways. But I admit that, you know, other kids, you know, their heroes were rock stars or athletes. But, you know, most of the posters in my room glorified the guys who made splatter films, you know. My heroes were guys like Tom Savini and Rob Bottin and George Romero.
Was Rick Baker one of those guys?
Rick Baker, yes, Stan Winston, you know. I read Fangoria magazine like other kids read Sports Illustrated, you know, and I was just completely hung up on that whole scene.
Yeah, and your mom and dad can't go to you and say, put that crap down, because they're partly responsible.
It's like reading the family business, man.
That's right.
You know, and you know, one of the things is the book, you know, the book is, it's, especially the beginning plays like a paranoid fantasy, but there is some humor in there. And you know, the special effects guys, you know, Tom Savini, whatever, when they have an alien bursting out of a guy's chest, they call that a gag. And I just think that horror and comedy, it's the same engine, just pumping out a, you know, moving in a different direction. They operate by the same rules, you know. The shock is what makes a great punchline and also what makes a great scare.
But it's nice because what it means is that they both serve the same purpose, which is to trigger a reaction from the audience to engage them in a different way.
Yeah, genuine emotional reaction, right? That's what you look for. You know, and actually a lot of horror, you know, relies too much on the shock. You know, I think when people think about horror, they think about the half-naked teenagers hanging from meat hooks. And, but I actually think that's like not, at this point, it's so worn out, it's not scary at all. You know, Hitchcock, back in the 50s, people thought of him as a horror director. Now he seems too classy. You know, we call him a thriller director, but he was definitely directing horror, and he was the master of these wrong man scenarios where a guy feels the whole world is turned against him, and all the people he thought he could trust, he couldn't trust, and all the people he loved, you know, it turns out they don't love him back. And there's a little bit of that in Horns, you know.
For you to get to that place, I mean, a couple books published. How old were you when you got that article published? Like 11? Were you 11 or 12 when you had an article published?
Yeah, I don't think it was my best work. I've polished my craft a little bit since then. Yeah, that's right.
How did you define your own name? Because, I mean, you have found a way. I mean, people didn't know that your dad was Stephen King. They didn't know who your mom was, and your mom is a hell of a writer in her own right. So to get to this place, do you feel like you've now forged your identity? The reviews are about you now.
Well, you know, when I started out, I was in college. I knew I wanted to be a writer. I'd always loved make-believe. And I got this idea in college that it might be a very dangerous to write as Joseph King. Because I thought, you know, there would be a temptation for a publisher to leap on a mediocre piece of work and publish it because they saw a quick buck in the last name. And you know, if you have a famous last name, readers might buy your first book. But if the book is no good, they won't buy the second one. And so I looked at this last name as not an advantage, but something that could cut my legs out from under me very quickly. So I decided to drop it, and I thought, well, I'll just go it alone. And it was really mission accomplished because I spent 10 years, I wrote 4 books that no one wanted.
And there you got rejection letters and all that.
Yeah, rejection letter after rejection letter, and I wasn't having fun at the time, but looking back, I feel it was mission accomplished because, you know, those were, you know, every writer has to make their mistakes and learn their craft, and, you know, and eventually when I sold my first book of stories and then Heart-Shaped Box, I feel that they sold for the right reason because publishers were excited about the stories instead of about my, you know, genealogy.
I want to say your genealogy, I want to talk about your mother, only because when your dad's been on the program, he talked about how it was your mother that saved Carrie by pulling it out of the trash. Yeah. But on your first book, like what kind of literary advice did your mother give you?
Actually, it's funny. I mean, it's like deja vu all over again. I worked on this one book. I worked on it for 3 years, and it became a huge international bestseller in my imagination. But in real life, it was turned down in America, England. It was turned down by a few places in Canada. I mean, the whole idea had been to write this thing like, what if John Irving tried to write The Hobbit? And I guess the result of that would be an unpublishable mess, you know. And I was demoralized, you know. I was completely defeated after all the rejections rolled in. And I remember calling my mom and saying, I don't know what I'm going to do now. What do I do now? She said, you're going to write another book, which was kind of exactly what I needed to hear. So she's, you know, she's definitely the strongest one in the family in terms of picking people up after setbacks.
And telling you, you know, leave that book. That book's done.
Yeah, it's over. It's time to move on. And what's funny is, you know, they're really, I mean, it's a corny, cheesy cliche, but I don't believe there are ever creative failures. There are sometimes stories that don't work, which then become, you know, useful fertilizer for, you know, a successful, I suppose a lot of my fishing could be looked at as fertilizer, really. I'm sure some people do, but, you know, but there were actually elements of The Fear Tree, that big epic fantasy novel that failed, which I wrote, you know, 8, 9 years ago. There were actually elements of that story that found their way into Horns, certain character ideas and so on. So
yeah, I always wonder why authors don't get the same freedoms that some musicians get, where you're allowed to have 2 or 3, you know, mediocre records before you have a masterpiece. Like, in a sense, you have to also go out there and learn. You almost, like, you apply the Malcolm Gladwell, he didn't invent it, but the idea of the outliers, you know, you need 10,000 hours to get good at something. I mean, for a writer, it's almost like you need thousands upon thousands upon thousands of words before you're going to get good at this.
I think it's about 10,000 pages. You know, I think it takes about, and what people say is they say, you know, it took me 10 years and 10,000 pages to find my voice. But that's a little misleading because it makes it sound like your authorial voice is a hat lost in an attic somewhere. And if you just poke around long enough, you'll find it, and then you just wear the hat, and you'll always make beautiful writing. But really, you search for your voice every single day. It takes you 10 years to figure out what it is that you can write about in a special way that other people can't write about. You know.
All right, stick around. More with Joe Hill, and we'll play 220 with him right after this. Who's your favorite horror writer not named King or Hill? Do you believe in ghosts? What's scarier, waking up with a set of horns or waking up next to Gary Busey?